Just as a reminder, you can visit us at thoughtsexpanded.com. That's thoughtsexpanded.com to sign up for our amazing Patreon exclusives, listen directly, and share our latest episodes with your family and friends. Thanks for listening.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Thoughts Expanded. I'm Jeff, joined by co-host Jacob.
Hey.
And Wiggy.
What's up?
And our very special guest today, Wes Bishop, professor of American and Public History at Jacksonville State University. Did I get that all right?
That is correct. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. I work with Wes's wife, Allison, and got to meet Wes not that long ago, and had some great conversations and pretty much knew instantly that he'd be a really great guest the show here. So, why don't you give us a little introduction to yourself, Wes?
Hi, well, like I said, first of all, thank you for having me on your podcast. Really appreciate it. And so, like Jeff was saying, I'm an assistant professor of American and Public History at Jacksonville State University. So my areas of specialty are in political history, but specifically on kind of the evolution of political thought, social movements, how they've used public space, memory. And I'm currently working on a book about the vice presidency, disability, and presidential succession. And I know that was something you all said that you were potentially interested in discussing today because as we're recording this, right, there's the election tomorrow. So that's what I'm working on. My previous work has looked at the fat liberation movement and American populism and the way it influenced the creation of the New Deal.
Right on. And you had a book come out just recently, correct?
Yeah, in August, on fat liberation specifically. It's called Liberating Fat Bodies, and it looks at the way that fat activists and artists and just users in social media have been censored by specifically Meta, but also X. And so that was an oral history project where we interviewed over a dozen activists and artists, and you just showed how they were censored over time for being fat. And then also the history of fat liberation and the issues of fat liberation are all covered in that book. The book's out with Palgrave, actually. So, yeah.
Right on. Cool.
Great. I think you're our first guest who had a book come out, so that's neat.
Oh, great.
You're our first professional guest, I would say. Maybe not.
True.
I will not. What I will say is that I'll kind of take that back. Like Jeff was saying, we have had professional artists, we have had professional let's just say academic. Let's say academic. You've been our first academic that we've had on the podcast.
Yeah, that is accurate. Yeah.
I was going to say one thing about the fat liberation. Did you guys talk to anybody from Meta or X or anything like that? Like, did they ever respond for with comment?
No, and we were very conscious in this. We did not want to, Meta has, a huge platform and it can address these issues. And so we never even tried to make contact with them. Although we did, go in depth to their policies and look through like what they were saying and showed the conflict, right? That they were not doing what they said they were doing. Meta has been really weird with this because they know that if they just come out and say that they're doing it, that they're going to be in hot water, but everyone knows that they're doing it. And so, yeah, it's one of those that it was actually a really good question, Jacob. We early on, my co-writer and I talked about this and we're like, they have a huge platform. If they want to put a response out to this or they want to make a stance on this, they can, but we're not going to give them a platform because, they've consistently ignored the users that we interviewed. And that is something else that we were able to show. I mean, the blatant disregard for when the users actually had concerns and tried to bring them up. Different unions, labor unions had brought this issue up with Meta and they would ignore it. So.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's basically just like AI responding to you at this point. I mean, if you try
essentially
to do any kind of official complaint. Yeah, and I guess we kind of leading into our topic at hand, Wes sort of gave our disclaimer for us. this is being recorded the night before the U.S. presidential election. So obviously we have no idea what happened. We have no idea what the craziness that may or may not happen in Pennsylvania tomorrow or, anywhere else. So to keep that in mind, dear listener, Wes comes out probably 2 weeks after that we didn't know. We didn't know what was happening.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a particularly interesting election to have a conversation with U.S. because, you have this, history and knowledge of vice presidents. And I don't know that we'll ever see a situation, or have we ever seen, that's actually a question. Have we ever seen a situation where a vice president ran for president while vice president? You know what I mean? Like Kamala Harris is vice president, but is running for president. Do we have any other situations like that in the past?
Well, so you do have situations, right, where vice presidents, have run for president while in the administration, right? So most recent, right, would be like, I'm trying to think, like Al Gore, right, is a good example of that. He's running for office as vice president while vice president. You have George H.W. Bush, right, who does it. So that's really not that uncommon or that unheard of. It's in the same way that people run for office while they're still senator, right, or still governor. That those things do occur. What makes this election in 2024 unique is that it was not planned, right? It was not planned that she was going to be running for president, and Joe Biden did not die in office. That didn't happen. So there wasn't a succession to her being president. That you basically had, you have had a situation where the president, the sitting president, Joe Biden, right, is forced to withdraw his nomination for the presidency of the United States, even though he wants to run, because there's medical concerns, right? There's medical concerns over his ability, specifically his cognitive ability because of advanced age, to do the job, right? And so he is forced to he's forced to step out of the campaign and endorse Harris, right? Who then becomes the de facto nominee. And that has never happened before, right? Where you have like this kind of situation play out. Now, what will be interesting, I think, is, so we're recording this right before the election. And this is going to impact my book quite a bit, is if Harris is successful and is actually elected the next president of the United States, I'm going to be curious to see how this plays out, right? With people being like, oh, okay, well, like you can have a fairly peaceful transfer of power and it wasn't disastrous. If, on the other hand, right, it doesn't pan out that way, if Harris loses, Trump wins a second term, I'm curious to see how the fallout for that is going to trickle out into the people who forced Biden to step down, major donors in the party. And that, I just don't know. I haven't seen anybody really having that conversation yet. So that will be interesting. Like I said, it might be a moot point. She might win, right? And that's that. But if she loses, if she loses, the autopsy of the campaign, right, will undoubtedly involve something of that.
Interesting. That's something I had not really thought of at all. The fallout of the kind of forced succession of Kamala to Biden. That's interesting.
And unfortunately, if that happens, I feel like people will be saying like Biden would have won, even if that's not true, just because of the fact that he did beat Trump once. So
I agree, Jacob. I think that is a potential line of argument that will happen. Of course, other people might come back and say, no, he was going to lose anyway. And if polling is to be believed, right, that is certainly true. Before he dropped out, Georgia was beginning to lean Republican in the polls, and North Carolina was not in play. Once Harris gets into the campaign, Georgia returns to a toss-up, and North Carolina becomes a toss-up. So again, it's kind of interesting as a historian, right, to be like, I don't know, but like it's like, in the future there will be an established narrative that happens, right? But it kind of shows you, and I guess this is kind of nice to get this on the record, that whatever established narrative comes out of this, it's not fixed, right? That is a hindsight, insight that people are bringing to this election.
Have we had a situation before where either party essentially just skipped their primary in favor of, and I mean, in this case, right, it's Kamala, and like they just didn't have a primary. They just said, she's it. That's the way we're going. There was no discussion over it. Has that happened before with either parties? Just like, this is what we're going to do.
One thing to keep in mind is primaries themselves are a fairly recent invention in American history. It doesn't happen until about the 1900s, right? I think it's Teddy Roosevelt, right, is like one of the first like actual primaries you have. It's somewhere in there, like in the early 1900s. I could look it up. Before that, what would happen is that the party would just hold a convention, and the delegates would show up and they would debate it out, and you would get basically whoever the party leaders wanted. There was no real input from the American people on who the major candidates were going to be. And I mean, the reasoning behind that is they're private entities, right? They're not government agencies. I mean, they could decide to run whoever they want. But, in the progressive era, there was this push to have more open democracy, right? More participation. And I do agree. It's actually been for the best. And so that's how you get the primary season. To answer your question about whether or not you just like skip the primary and go straight to a candidate, I mean, you have had instances where you basically know who the candidate, like who the nominee is going to be, right? There might be a primary, there might be some like actors there, but like in recent elections, I can tell you no. Like this is again what happened with Harris, right? Is an anomaly, right? It's why this election has been very interesting and why so many historians and political scientists are kind of like shrugging their shoulders. Like we're not really sure, right, what's going to happen because I mean, there are some people who are pretty assured of their models and their predictions, right? But in all honesty, right, for a historian who uses the past as a way to help kind of understand the present, there's nothing that's ever been done like this in American history. I mean, like this, I'm not even just recent history, but just American history, where you have a sitting president who is still alive, is still cognizant and aware of where he is, right? I mean, we can debate, diminished cognitive abilities, right? But it's not like he's completely in the throes of dementia or anything. Right? He knows where he's at, right? He knows he's salient. He can speak and all of that. But they're just worried about his age. And they force him out because of concerns over his ability, right? And then he willingly gives up his bid to the presidency. And since it's so late in the primary season, right, it's just the VP becomes person. There was some chatter in op-eds and among party leaders and among activists about like, well, who's going to replace him? And I agree with this. They're like, anybody, if you don't choose Harris, right, it's like, what are you basically doing at that point, right? Like, it's like, this was the person that we said could be president, right, if Biden couldn't do it anymore. So she is the rational choice because we're not going to have time to do a primary. So, to answer your question, it's, no, there's not really a precedent for it. It's quite odd.
Well, I feel like, in the elections where a candidate is established and they're running for their second term, there is effectively not a primary. They still go through the motions. So they did not go through the motions this time at all? I mean, I know for a while it was like, I like to follow the Marianne Williamson campaign. I like Marianne Williamson a lot. And for a while, like, she was posting as if she was running in a primary against Biden, and then effectively felt like she had the rug pulled out from under her that primary didn't occur. Like, that was her stance on it. So they literally, I mean, did people vote for a primary candidate? I know that there was the uncommitted campaign, right, that ran against, like, tried to count votes against Biden in some primary states. Like, a vote did occur, right? It's just that your primary didn't select the candidate. That's the thing.
Right. Yeah. So when a person is the sitting president and is running for re-election, it's usually a done deal, right? And so what you're alluding to, right, is in this campaign cycle, right, when we had, because there is a primary, right? The states have primaries. The Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, had some opposition, right? He did have some opposition, right, from either activists or there was a congressman, I forget, somewhere in the upper Midwest, right, who was running against him, but they really didn't go anywhere, right? And that does happen. And yes, you do have primary. I mean, like every candidate, right? And since the primaries were created, right? they do have to run in those primaries, even if they're the sitting president. It's just, well, I guess my point is that it's never been like, we got a new person now. Like, you know what I mean? And the old person is still here, right? Like that's never happened before. It's like the person's already doing the job and they're just keeping the job. Or, I mean, if he had died in office, right, and then she just assumed the presidency, at that point, it would have just been some paperwork. It wouldn't have even been a question. It's like, yeah, because of the way Article 2 of the Constitution works, she's the president now. And if she wants to run, she can run.
Sure. Makes sense. Okay. So I guess maybe it'd be worth talking about that. Has that occurred since the primary system came into place? Like, has there been a situation where one candidate won the primary and then another candidate became the actual candidate on the ballot due to a death?
Then I know.
This is really unique even to that.
Yeah, I'm trying to. I mean, the only reason I say I'm hesitant with that is none of the people who win the presidency, right, have had this happen to them while they're campaigning, right? Like when the deaths happen, it's long out before the election, right? And so there's plenty of time if they wanted to have an opponent, they could. Lyndon Johnson, right? Lyndon Johnson resigns. He says he's not going to run, so that gives time, right, for a primary. Any of the people who challenge them, no, I don't think so. I don't think there has been at the top of the ticket. Now, bottom of the ticket's a different story. The vice president, that's a different story. But presidents, no, nobody has either died or become incapacitated. And then the bottom of the ticket had to step in and fulfill that. It's just never happened before. There was a case in the 70s with the George McGovern campaign, and I am writing about this in the book, where his running mate, it becomes known, publicly known. And, Nixon's running for re-election. McGovern is a very liberal candidate, right, running against him. And, the Nixon campaign would play fast and dirty, right? They were not above that. And, it becomes known that, Eagleton, McGovern's running mate, had sought treatment for depression. And there's still stigma about this in American society, but especially then. And it became this whole blown out thing of like, well, if McGovern dies in office and you have someone like Eagleton who has depression, can we trust somebody who has mental health issues, right, in office? And that kind of gets to the themes of what I'm exploring in this research topic about how disability, right, and differences in ability play out in presidential politics. So McGovern's forced to drop Eagleton. He does that. Picks a new candidate, and McGovern loses horribly. So it's like, I think he loses all but one state in the election. Nixon, sweeps the electoral map in that election.
Interesting. Yeah. It's an interesting case. Like, if he's weak enough to be forced by the other side to switch his VP candidate, like maybe that signals to people that it's a done deal.
Again, I'm not an expert in the 1970s, but that is something that historians do say that they do attribute to it. I mean, part of it is Nixon was quite popular, right? This is before Watergate, right? This is before everything has become extremely public. And so Nixon was probably going to win no matter what. Which is also why Watergate is so weird, because it was one of those elections Nixon literally didn't have to do anything, but it was in that election that he actually, ordered people to go and break into the Watergate Hotel and spy on his opponents. And it's like, why? Like, why, man? Just go write your second inaugural, right? Like, this is done. Like, they're imploding on themselves left and right. And I mean, it speaks to a lot of issues with Nixon. But yes, the switching of the VP, right, mid campaign, did hurt McGovern, right? I mean, like, we could debate long and hard, right, about how much, but it did hurt him. I'll tell you, same thing happens with John McCain, right? John McCain was probably going to lose to Barack Obama, regardless of what John McCain said or did. You had 8 years of Republican, presidential politics at that point. Bush was not popular, coming into that campaign. And so the Republican Party was definitely out of favor. But Sarah Palin, right? I mean, there was serious talk about, whether or not McCain was going to have to jettison Sarah Palin as a liability. But that doesn't happen, right? He doesn't do that, and he loses anyway. So
when all of this started going down in June, and like that first debate happened, and it was like, this is awful. He's not looking good. What are we gonna do? And then he stepped down and named Kamala. How did you think that was going to go? Because this is such a unique election. Like, there's so many factors at play. Like, I don't think we'll ever see anything like this again in our lifetimes, or maybe ever. But I had a hard time believing it would go as swimmingly as it has for Kamala with how late it all started for her. Did you foresee that happening? Like, what are your thoughts on how well it's gone for her since all this took place?
I agree. Initially, I was of the opinion initially that Biden should not step down. I was like, people voted him in. It was his choice to make, right? The Democrats did fairly well in the midterm elections. But after the performance in Atlanta at the debate, it just became impossible for him to ignore it, right? I mean, his closest allies are saying that you can't do it. And that's pretty bad, and so, I get where Biden was coming from, right? Where he's just like, well, I mean, they're just like, we're not going to be able to fundraise, right? We're going to need to fundraise. We're not going to be like, and not only just the presidency, but down ballot, right? It's going to hurt all of our chances. I was curious. I was skeptical, kind of like you, Jeff. Knowing the Democratic Party and knowing left-wing politics roles, I was like, this is probably going to turn into like a circular firing squad, right? Where everyone is just like, well, everyone's going to run for president, right? I was waiting for all the different people to throw their hats into the ring, right? But surprisingly, the Democratic Party and the liberals, right, have largely, kind of like fell into line, right? And actually done, I think, a pretty decent job of staying on message with each other. And that's something that the Democrats don't normally, they're not as well known for it, right? I mean, that's something that the Republicans are often credited with, like the ability to kind of lockstep and do everything in unison together, right? And play as a team. But yeah, no, Harris has been able to do that, to the point that, at this point, I mean, Biden really is a footnote in the election, right? I was teasing a student today. They stopped by my office and they're like, well, what do you think is going to happen in the election? I was like, it's an unpopular opinion, but I think Biden is going to lose, right? So, it's like he's just become like this like footnote, right? And like nobody's really thinking about him anymore. And that's impressive, right? That was an impressive thing that Harris did. And again, we can talk more about this. This is just my 2 cents. If Harris loses tomorrow, I think it will largely be because of Biden's policies and foreign policy. I think the uncommitted movement in Michigan, a lot of Arab American voters, right, in Michigan and Pennsylvania, right. If Trump wins, it will be probably because of that. Again, it's impossible to say without seeing like the actual vote returns, but I imagine that will be the kiss of death for the Democratic Party if they lose. Right now, if they win, that will be a whole other thing. That's a whole other analysis.
I think as just observers, I'll speak for myself. I see the exact same thing as you just said. Like we've kind of hinted on it before too. Like it's really foreign policy and the constant arguing about the border, right? Like those are really the two things that if they can't hold it together, that's going to be why.
Right. Yeah, because in terms of
even
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that like that just seems to be the consensus. Like, so it's interesting that from your perspective, you see the exact same thing.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of domestic policy, right, there are pretty clear differences between the two. And when I talk to people in the base, right, of either the Republican or the Democratic Party, Trump is a conservative on domestic policies, and Harris is pretty lefty, right? Much more so than Biden on some of these questions about either healthcare or LGBTQ rights, definitely reproductive rights. There's really no criticism from her base on that, right? There's actually a lot of support for it. But yeah, I mean, it's in foreign policy, and it's fair or unfair, right? I mean, she doesn't have any control over it right now. I mean, she's not in the presidency, but yeah. I mean, and this also, to answer your previous questions, kind of circle back to it about, the difficulty of a vice president running for office. This often is the thing that will hurt a vice president, is that they are running for the job while working for another person who has the job. and they have to simultaneously sell that this guy that they are working for is doing a good job, while also saying they're going to do something new and different, but also continue the successes of the previous guy. It's one of those. It's kind of like hard to do, right? It's a hard needle to, hard needle to thread. And some have done it more successfully than others. And again, this is just my 2 cents. I mean, I think Harris has done an okay job with it. I wouldn't say it's the best job I've ever seen, but Al Gore struggled with it. H.W. Bush, right? This was an issue. Just the thing was, Reagan was just really popular, right? Reagan was really popular at the end of his second term and was able to ride those kind of coattails. John Adams, right, is able to do this at the end of George Washington's campaign, or George Washington's 2 terms, right, and is able to get an election win. I think William Howard Taft, right, after Teddy Roosevelt, again, very popular president. So, if Harris wins tomorrow, right, that will be the interesting thing. I mean, Biden, won by considerable margins in 2020, but I don't think anybody would say was an overly popular president, not like Teddy Roosevelt or George Washington or anything like that. So that's another thing that, in terms of vice presidents, right, when they're running for office, right, that they have to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I hadn't thought about it before. Right now, that a lot of my criticisms of Harris ultimately do come down to foreign policy, and it's like I have felt in the past like I am an odd man out in that category, right? Like that generally the American electorate does not care about foreign policy. So, do you have thoughts on how we ended up in a situation where this is a foreign policy election?
Well, I think for what I was saying, right, is that for Arab Americans, it is like this is one of these central issues, particularly for Palestinian Americans, right, who have seen a lot of their family members and friends killed in the war. And I think for people who have been following what's been going on in Gaza and the West Bank and what Israel has been doing for decades, right, that it's kind of like a moment of reckoning, right, where we've had a year-long war where Israel has done massive land grabs, and it's extending now into Lebanon, right? And I think this is also what has people who are paying attention to this really terrified, is that if there's not brakes applied to this, where's this going to end? That, this is going to continue to accelerate into other parts of the region because the Israeli government, and this is way beyond the purview of what we're talking about tonight, has made it clear that they are going to grab as much land as possible, right, to increase the settlements. So for Arab Americans, right, that's an issue. And in Michigan, they are a huge portion of the Democratic Party. And so, I've had this conversation with people who are more focused on domestic policies, right, because it impacts them more directly, right? They're not Muslim, or they haven't been following what's been going on in the Middle East. And they're like, well, I get that, right? That's an important issue, right? But why, let's focus on these other things. And I'm sympathetic to what they're saying, but at the same time, it's like you basically told a huge part of the bloc, right, and in a key state in this election that they don't matter. And so I think that is why it's become such an issue in the election, right, where you have a key demographic of the Democratic Party who has been ignored by the party leadership. And so, whereas other groups, right, environmentalists, LGBTQ rights activists, pro-reproductive rights activists, right, civil rights activists, right, all of these domestic issues, right, I think I said environmentalists, like, they're all on board, right? It's like the Democratic Party has not done a lot to actually assure Arab American voters that their concerns about this war are going to actually be addressed in the next administration. And so, ultimately, if she loses votes, I think that's why. And as a result, it's forced the other factions, the other groups, right, within the Democratic Party to pay attention to it.
Well, on our election episode the other night, we kind of came to the conclusion that one of the major differences, like in actual material, like administration that these two presidents would offer, is that Trump might get us out of the Ukraine war faster. Not that that would necessarily be better. Do you think anyone cares about that? Do you think like Republicans are voting for Trump based on that?
No, I don't. I do think there are Republicans who are anti supporting Ukraine. Just like I think there are like a lot of moderates and even maybe some Democrats who don't really care one way or the other. But I do think within the Democratic Party, there is and even among moderates, there's a consensus that Russia's out of line with Ukraine and that we're actually, aiding a country that is, actively being Russia is attempting to overthrow, right? And kind of swallow up into its own country. When I've talked to Republicans about this, and it's mostly like my students, my colleagues, right? Just people I know here in Alabama. They're like, oh, I mean, they just kind of see it as like another foreign war. They're like, why are we there? Like Russia didn't do anything to us, which, I mean, to be fair, that's true, right? I mean, Russia and Ukraine are both like technically allies to the United States. And Ukraine's not the United States. And so I think that's kind of more how it is. I've had a couple students whose parents are in the military or they themselves are in the National Guard, or in the military, like other branches of the military. And they're worried about being mobilized, right, into a longer conflict, right, for Ukraine against Russia. But no, I think, honestly, the key issue that Republicans say that they are concerned about is immigration. And it's this kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric. I really think that is like the key issue that a lot of them are attracted to with Trump, that they see Trump as somebody who is going to not just take a strong stance on stopping immigration, both legal and illegal, right? But also that there will be some kind of cruelty wrapped up in it, right? That there will be a punishment involved in stopping immigration, both legal and illegal immigration to the United States.
Yeah, I find it kind of, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit on some of our prior episodes. But what we've been noticing is kind of the, and it's happened once or twice before, but we're kind of noticing a little bit of the side flipping that tends to happen every years, where the different parties just seem to take on aspects of the other party when after a period of time. And so like Republicans are really focused on domestic issues at the moment, whereas Democrats seem to be really focused on social and the global impacts of things, right? And that was historically kind of the other way around, right? You had the idea of like the Republican wars. You had, whereas most of the Democrats were mostly focused on social programs within inside the country, right? And that seems to be flipping. And so from a historical perspective, I know that's kind of happened a couple times, but do you have any like insight on like how often that's happened, or like kind of like how far apart that seems to happen?
Sure. Yeah, so political historians refer to changes in the major makeups of the parties as party realignment. So the first phase of American party politics, are the Federalists versus the Southern Democratic Republicans. Southern Democratic Republicans eventually collapse, right? And you enter what's called the then you have the Whigs, right? You have the era of good feeling, sorry about that. And then you have the Whigs and Democrats, right? That's the second phase. And then the third phase is the Republicans and Democrats, right? That you move into during in the run up to the Civil War. Eventually, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party switch locations completely. And the Republican Party goes from being a progressive left-wing party, which it was under Lincoln in the Civil War, to being a conservative party. And the Democrats go from being a conservative, frankly, racist party, to being a multiracial, multi-ethnic progressive party. And the way that happens, it's very it's complicated, but you essentially have labor reforms, unions, right, political protests that push the Democratic Party to the left. And then finally, under Lyndon Johnson, a Southerner, he endorses civil rights, and that's what makes the Democratic Party kind of come into this full rotation of being a left-wing party. And then under Nixon, you have what's called the Southern Strategy, where the Republicans adopt the Southern segregationists, who are no longer in the Democratic Party. And then the Republican Party becomes a conservative, reactionary, and frankly racist right party in many of its wings. And so, there's no like clock to it, right? It's really kind of some of the periods last really long. Some of them last for very few years. The Whig Party did not last very long in American politics. And so I would argue that, yes, the political parties we currently see right now are probably undergoing some kind of change. What that is, we don't know. people have pointed to Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump both as these populist-like candidates who did bring, or I should say, usher this kind of change, right, that you see within the Republican Party, where the Republican Party has become far more right-wing, like explicitly far more right-wing than it was just even 10, 15, 20 years ago. And the Democratic Party has largely remained the same as a pro-civil rights party, but those civil rights have been expanded quite a bit, right, to include LGBTQ people. And also, like I said, I mean, they're seeing it right now with the hurting, right, of ignoring Arab American voters. That's an interesting point, Wiggy, that you bring up about the change from focusing on domestic to foreign policy. I think that the Republicans still are very much focused on foreign policy. It's just the way that they're going about it. It is this kind of isolationist like rhetoric where Trump and other Republicans are basically saying we need a strong-armed, almost authoritarian-like figure in the White House. And then they'll go talk to the other authoritarian figures in the world and they'll hammer out a deal as the strongmen of these different nations. And what the Republican Party has increasingly been doing, and this was true under Bush, is moving away from democratic institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, and ignoring them. And so I think that it's actually a continuation of what we've seen. It's like they're still interested in foreign policy. They just don't want any deliberation with it with other nations, right? They don't want NATO or the EU or the UN, right, to really have any kind of say over what the United States can and can't do. So I think that's what we're seeing, right? And whereas the Democratic Party has kind of continued down this line of we need these democratic institutions internationally, right? We need to be present at the UN. We need to be participating in the World Health Organization, things like that.
That makes sense. I mean, Biden, I guess, was like happy to ignore some of those things in the same ways that Trump did when it suited him. But yet, like that doesn't mean they're moving away. I mean, I was doing some research. Jeff sent us your presentation, your PowerPoint presentation. So before this episode, I was doing a little research on Woodrow Wilson. It was mentioned that is kind of the trend that we see with the Democrats embracing this internationalism almost started with him.
Yes.
So really we're seeing a continuation from before what you even said was the official, party swap, right? There's that thread back in the Democratic Party going back before that, that still is affecting politics to this day.
Yeah, so essentially Wilson is president he's one of the three major figures of the progressive era in terms of presidential politics, right? So you have Teddy Roosevelt, who's like the progressive era president, William Howard Taft, right, who serves one term, and then Woodrow Wilson serves 2 terms. And the progressives were all about trying to figure out how to make this new corporate economy work with democracy. And people had different views, everything ranging from socialism to unfettered capitalism, right? And everything in between. The progressives had many different ideas on this. Wilson's main idea as a foreign policy advocate was that the U.S. needed to get involved in international affairs if it wanted to influence international affairs. So specifically World War I. He's like, if we don't get involved in World War I, if we don't take sides, then we're not going to be able to negotiate the peace deal. And that's going to hurt our corporations. And we need to have the ability to negotiate international deals because our corporations are so productive now that they are producing too much and they need global markets to go sell their stuff. And so, I mean, basically what Wilson's saying is that Starbucks needs to be able to go to China, right? Coca-Cola needs to be able to sell stuff in Kenya, right? Like it needs to be able to do that. It needs the resources, right, that are in wherever, right? Sierra Leone or wherever it is, right? And he's like, the only way we're going to do that is if Britain and France allow us at the table, because Britain and France have colonized everything and they're not going to open their colonies up to our businesses unless we have something to bring to the table. And that's militarism. That's the military fight, right? So that's why that's really Wilson's big push to get the U.S. involved in the war. That it's not really that complicated, but if I had a dime for every time an American history textbook doesn't get it, right? It's like it's a pretty cut and dry like business reason, like, and he's pretty explicit about what he wants to do. And so my book looks at Wilson, right? Because Wilson, in his final year of office, he goes after U.S. enters World War I, right? The U.S. plays a decisive role in helping Britain and France win World War I. And they have the peace treaty, right? They had the peace conference in Paris. And France and Britain go back on everything that they said, right? And they're like, hey, we are not giving up our colonies. We're not allowing American businesses just to do whatever they want, right? Because basically Wilson's like, they need to have self-determination. We need to have a League of Nations, something like the UN. And Britain and France are like, yeah, okay, that's nice, buddy. You go back to DC, get out of here. And so they eventually work out a very compromised position of what Wilson wanted. He brings it back to DC. Wilson was deeply unpopular by this point. And he suffers a stroke. And at that point, he's going to spend the rest of his presidency, really a whole year, incapacitated, not able to do the job of the president. And at that point, his vice president, Thomas Marshall, is faced with a question of, does Marshall get involved? Does he actually force Wilson to give up the presidency and take it, and then take the power himself? And Marshall decides not to do it. And to me, that is fascinating because political history is often about what people do, the things that they say, the actions that they take. And Thomas Marshall, by choosing to do this, fills out a whole historical record by being silent, by not doing anything. And it creates this like interesting precedent of vice presidents. And it had already been there, but Marshall really helps to like solidify it. The vice president is really subservient to the president and will not challenge the president directly. And I find that fascinating. And so the book really focuses in on Marshall in particular, but it builds out from there. It builds out into the early years of American history and later all the way up to the Biden campaign.
You know, I find that interesting because that's kind of mimicked in our military as well. Like you specifically have, like, take a submarine, for example. You have the captain in charge of the submarine, and then you have first officer. If for some reason the first officer decides that the captain is not following orders or whatever the case may be, he's causing some kind of jeopardy, it's his duty to essentially relieve the captain of duty, right? And that's kind of the same idea, right? Like if something's wrong with the president, he's compromised, if he or she is unable to carry out the duties, then it's their duty to do the thing, right? But it doesn't happen. We have it built into our laws. We have it built into our codes. We have it built in everywhere. It just doesn't happen. And the case could also be argued as to if Biden was so incapacitated to the place where he could not run again. You know, the joke's been made, and I'm sure you've heard it, is that we don't have a president right now. Like that's the joke that's been bandied around everywhere, is we don't even have a president right now, right? Like, so what's stopping Kamala from saying, okay, like he's just not there, I'm going to become president? Because she actually has been president for an hour.
Yes.
Biden underwent a colonoscopy and was under for an hour, and during that time she was effectively president. So but what's really stopping her? I mean, I know that's more of just a political strategy question, but also just from a history question. What's stopping her from saying he's not okay? And like he's had some crazy speeches over the past month. Like, so what's your thoughts on why she hasn't done that?
So you're right. Harris has served as an hour, right, and as president. He underwent, like you said, a colonoscopy. This has happened before. Actually, it happened like 2 or 3 times under George W. Bush. And Dick Cheney would, be acting president. I believe it was a colonoscopy in both cases with Bush as well. And what's interesting about the Bush points is they did this publicly for a very specific reason, because they wanted to show that they were using the 27th Amendment, right? That it's section 3 of the 27th Amendment that allows a president to temporarily transfer powers over to the vice president and then retake them back, right? So the way it's supposed to work, as I understand it, right, is they write it out. They say, I am transferring my powers over. And then when they get back, and then they write it again and they say, I am reassuming it. And so it's like, that's to show that they're in the right mind. And then it comes back to them. The answer to your question about why Harris is not invoking essentially what you're talking about, the 27th Amendment, right? Because there's 4 sections to the 27th Amendment. And the one that she would have to invoke is, I'm looking here at my notes to make sure I get it right, is the fourth. It's the fourth section of the 27th Amendment. What that does is it allows the vice president to assemble the cabinet, and a majority of the cabinet then votes to say, yeah, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. This guy can't be president, right? And it's very vague, right? It's very vague about like, what does that mean? Inability. What does that mean? Fitness, right? Medically, right? Like and it's purposely left vague because the people who wrote it, right? This was passed in the 1960s. They wanted to leave it kind of vague so that people could kind of figure it out as they went along. That's again something that is criticized about the U.S. Constitution, but also like applauded. Right? It's like, this is generally the spirit of what we're going for, and you all need to figure out how to make it work, right, in practice. I think the simple answer for why she doesn't is because she would be labeled as a usurper, right? That she would be labeled as somebody who wants power too much, and that she doesn't respect the rule of law. I think that's the whole thing, right? It's never been done before, right? She is literally the first Black woman to run for office, and she's like, this is not tripping me up, right? But it's also the reason why Thomas Marshall didn't do it, right? There was no 27th Amendment, so it wasn't really clear legally, although he probably, like, there wouldn't have been a huge amount of opposition to it because Wilson was pretty unpopular by that point, and the Republicans really hated him. So he probably could have gotten away with it. But it just wasn't how Marshall was. Chester Arthur, right, also faces this issue when James Garfield is shot and basically languishes in bed for weeks and weeks and weeks. Arthur refuses to kind of usurp, right, because he's afraid that he'll be labeled as a usurper. And with Arthur, there was actually a really good reason. He had been handpicked as the vice president by James Garfield's political rival. So James Garfield, wins in the convention. There's no primary, right? So he becomes the presidential candidate. And his major rival doesn't want Garfield to be president. So he straddles him with his lackey, right? Roscoe Conkling, like straddles James Garfield with Chester Arthur. And when there's the assassination attempt, right? When he's shot, the assassin says, I did this for Roscoe Conkling and Chester Arthur. It turns out later that there's no connection, right? That this guy, he was a deranged gunman. But Arthur's like, yeah, no, if I take the presidency while Garfield's still alive, like they'll hang me, right? And so he also, for precedent, doesn't do that, right? So there's these interesting like reasons why it happens. Like Marshall, it's just not his personality. He doesn't want to be president. Arthur literally, it also wasn't his personality. He didn't want to be president either, but he hated the job, but like also knows that he would be in deep trouble if he did it. And so I think that's ultimately why. Right, that is ultimately why Harris doesn't do it. The other interesting case that I'm writing about in this book is with Mike Pence. Mike Pence is the other recent vice presidential figure who has been called upon seriously by people to invoke the 27th Amendment. So after the January 6th insurrection attempt, members of Congress on the floor were like, Mike Pence needs to invoke Section 4 of the 27th Amendment, get the cabinet together, and get rid of Trump. And Pence can then do the peaceful transfer of power. Pence doesn't do it because he wants to run for president, and he's worried that it will hurt him with Trump voters. That's just me observing it, right? Like he has not donated his papers yet to archives or historians to go through, but it is really clear, I think, about what is going on here. So I think that's why, though. That's why Harris doesn't do it. It would hurt her. But I'll tell you, Michael Moore and other people after Biden drops out of the race, there's calls for him to drop out of the presidency so that Harris can run as the incumbent. She would have had by this point, she would have had several weeks, she had months, right, of serving as president, right, and being able to set her own policies. Biden doesn't do that. So, again, how that would have impacted it, we'll just never know.
I would almost speculate that maybe the conversation did happen as to whether or not to do that for Biden. And if the reason Biden stepped down was because he didn't want that to happen, because for weeks before he actually stepped down after the debate, he would say that only God can stop me from running. Like I am meant to run in this race. And so I think it probably did come down to a conversation like that.
I feel like maybe that was the trade-off that they made. Maybe he said like, you gotta let me finish out my term then. Like, maybe that was like part of the conversation. Like, you're not gonna end me early. Like I fought my entire career to get to this point, and you're not just gonna throw me out to the wolves, and you know, the establishment really loves him. Like they do. The establishment loves him because he just kind of goes along. Like his history just shows that he kind of goes along with whatever the narrative is. So like, yeah, maybe that was just part of the conversation. I mean, that's speculative, but
and eventually we'll trust me. There are people who want to know, right? Including me right now. It'd be nice that we have been privy to some of those conversations. I mean, if we follow the gossip, right, and the rumors, right? I mean, right before Biden drops out, there is a meeting with the donors and Harris, and the donors are like, "We're not giving another dime to Biden, right? Because it's a waste of money." And they're like, "Harris, you need to invoke this." And Harris repeatedly says, "No." I mean, according to this conversation, right? It's like, "I will not force him out," right? Because I think she sees it as political suicide. And in the story, the donors supposedly got really upset. But you're right. I mean, then that begs the question, what conversation was had? And again, like I said, we'll eventually get the documents and have a better idea. We just don't know right now.
Yeah, I mean, total speculation in my mind. It comes down a lot to Obama. I think that, he was able to kind of steal from Hillary Clinton the nomination in 2008 in some ways. Like he was able to take what she thought was a done deal for her. And then they kind of came to an uneasy alliance, Obama and Clinton. And I guess when I say Clinton, I mean both Hillary and Bill as like power brokers in the party, right? And then eventually Hillary got to run again in 2016, absolutely shit the bed. And well, I mean, it came down to things of the last second, obviously. But, I mean, in retrospect, we see it as a total failure, right? And that caused Obama's total ascendancy, right? I mean, he basically could control at that point the party, and he was able to do this to in some ways rig the 2020 primary for Joe Biden, right? He was able to play kingmaker that time. So
I would argue that he's still actually doing it.
Exactly. I think that it's I think it's he's the one somewhat behind the Kamala thing. I mean, at least like whether it's Obama personally or not, but like the force of Obama, I guess, is really what I need.
I don't think there's any doubt that Obama, in terms of the elder statespeople, right, of the Democratic Party, right, like former politicians that just serve as kind of like you said, right, like behind the scene advisors and influencers. Barack and Michelle Obama, right, are huge within the Democratic Party. And you are correct in that when Barack Obama starts to be like, Biden, I don't think you can do this. I don't think you're gonna be able to pull it off. That support really starts to evaporate at that point. I mean, once Biden kind of loses publicly the support of Obama, right? That's a lot of his base, right? And I do think Biden. Well, I mean, again, the 2020 election is very interesting. Biden was not doing very well in it. But the other candidates kind of solidified around Biden because Sanders would have won, probably would have won otherwise, right? Because the party was so fractured among the kind of more moderate to conservative wings. And I do think, I mean, Obama never had to even open his mouth, right, to endorse Biden in the primary, which I don't think he did. I don't think he formally endorsed anyone. But he was Obama's vice president, right? I mean, he was like, he was Obama's best friend, right? So it's like, I mean, I think it really helped Biden a lot in South Carolina, right? And, once Biden won South Carolina, it was, he was away with races and Sanders could never catch him again.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see if this election, if Harris does lose, what happens to that? Who steps up? Because it's not like there is a Obama to Obama's Clinton, or maybe I did that backwards, but there's no equivalent, right? It's not like when it's when Hillary lost and the Clintons were over, and there was somebody waiting there, right? Now it seems like if Kamala loses, what or who is going to be that power broker? That's a very interesting question.
I mean, this is just my 2 cents. And again, just using my crystal ball here, I think if Harris loses, we're not going to see another fair and open presidential election for several years. I really do believe that. I don't think what happened on January 6th, 2021 was a fluke. I think it very much, they're serious. They're serious about what they want to do. Project 2025 is very honest about what they want to do. And look, I mean, to the Republicans' credit, they haven't tried to hide any of this, right? I mean, they are openly campaigning on what they want to do in terms of elections. And so, we'll see.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question to you from a American historian point of view. Do you see a Trump win this year as being detrimental to future elections? I agree with you. I don't think we'll see another free and fair election if there's a Trump win this year as well. I don't know how long it'll be. I guess maybe that's another question for you. If Trump wins and that is true, how long do you think it would take before we get to the point where we're able to have another actual free election?
I honestly don't know. I do worry about it though. And I don't think this threat passes just after this election cycle. I think a lot of really smart people have watched what's happened for the past 8 years, and they're smarter, right? They're smarter than Trump, and they could make this work a lot better, right? So I don't know. The thing is that I tell people this is not unprecedented. I mean, in terms of federal elections, yes, this isn't unprecedented. That you're seriously talking right the night before the election of well, hell, we might not have another election, depending on how this one goes. During Reconstruction, right, after the fall of Reconstruction in the South, right, there weren't free and fair elections for a century, right? I mean, just didn't happen, right? So you have the Reconstructionists, the Republicans, right, black and white liberals, who are winning elections, right, sending congressional delegations, right, in the state house. I mean, it's majority black state legislature in South Carolina. And with the fall of Reconstruction, formally in 1877, that whole area of the South, right, moves into a period for a century where you do not have free and fair elections. And so that was 100 years. So, if history is a predictor of this, right, if this happens, right, in the 2024 election, a century, decades, maybe 2 or 3 years, I do think we run the risk of a sectional crisis. I really do think that a lot of political observers have started to talk about this, about the fears of a civil war within the United States. Maybe not like the Civil War of the 1860s where everyone dresses up in matching pajamas and goes and shoots at each other in a field, right? But something more akin to the Balkans or Syria, right? Where you have factors, right? Multi-fronts, right? Emerging. And it would be disastrous, right? It would be disastrous for the United States, which I think is ultimately why you see so much fear, right, and trepidation about what's going to happen tomorrow. I mean, we just don't know, right? This is for a federal election. For a federal election, this is somewhat unprecedented.
So what is it about the plan that they talk about specifically that makes it so dangerous? That makes it, just for anybody who's not paying attention, what is it that they're saying that is making it so likely that this would happen if Trump were to be elected?
So I think Trump has correctly identified that if he wants to stay out of prison, and he is a convicted felon at this point, right? He is waiting sentencing. I think it's late November, right, that he will be sentenced. He's correctly identified that if he wants to stay out of jail, his best bets are to win the presidency, because
Sure.
I honestly don't know. The federal judge probably won't sentence him. That's just my guess, right? They have not been willing to sentence him as a candidate. I don't see why they would be willing to sentence him as the sitting president. I just don't. And people have my students are what would that look like? And it's we don't know. We have no idea. House arrest, I'm not sure, right? I'm not really sure what that would look like at that point.
I mean, historically, it's been please go home.
Right.
Right. Right. It's just please vacate and go home, and we'll keep, the Secret Service around your house to make sure you don't.
Exactly. Right. But you would have this issue where he is president, and there's nothing in the Constitution that says he can't serve as president while in prison. Right. So, I just don't, I don't know about that like that. And I don't think anybody really knows. I think that's like up in the air. Like that's more, how does the cards play out? Like that's multiple actors deciding multiple things, right? I think in terms of what scares people is Trump literally saying this is the last election you're going to have to vote in, right? Of having people like JD Vance saying if you're a woman and you don't have children, you don't get to vote, right? It's like, I mean, there's no, it's not like a Ouija board, right? They're telling them pretty frankly like what they want to do, right? It's like, if you don't agree with us, we are not going to let you vote, right? It's like, okay, well, what do you mean by that exactly? Right? I mean, it's a pretty cut and dry statement, right? I mean, can you imagine if Harris got on the stage and was like, this is the last election we ever have. Don't worry, Alabama's never going to get to vote for a president again, right? It's like, I mean, if she said something like that, like just how much people would flip out about it, right? Rightfully so, like rightfully would be upset about it. So, I mean, within Project 2020-25, right? I mean, there's Jesus, like it's 900 pages long. I mean, people can go and like look through the summaries on it. I mean, things like abolishing the Department of Education, right? Abolishing any kind of checks or balances, the FBI's ability to investigate the president, all of these different things, right? The Department of Justice would be severely limited. I'm trying to think, and there is serious talks about changing the Constitution again so that you could have you could serve lifetime, right? Like in the presidency. And I wouldn't put it past them. Like, I mean, I really don't. Like, it's, again, I take them at their word, right? It's like, they say they want to do it. It's like, okay, well then they probably will do it,
And so taking a look at Israel, for example, with Netanyahu, he's done some of those things in Israel, right? Like his attempt to change their court system and things like that to make sure that he's not held accountable for anything that he does that made it bad, right?
Well, he's essentially a sitting president that is in the same situation that Trump would be in, just that if he ever loses power, he's voted for you. Almost certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, for not just the war, right, but for like crimes domestically, right? I mean, like,
right.
And so at this point, I mean, this is another reason why, I mean, people have talked about why the Israeli government has pursued what it wants. Now, Netanyahu is just one person, but yeah, the war has made him very popular, right, among his supporters. And so, the minute the war ends, right, and there's a cooling down, right, he could be going to jail. And so I think, honestly, that's what you would be facing with Trump, right? Trump would be like, if I ever leave office, there is a jail sentence probably waiting for me. And so we'll see.
Interesting.
Which would also, this is the thing I told somebody else. I was like, this is just me speculating here, complete speculation. As a citizen, I'm not even going to say this as a historian, just as an observer of American politics. I'm curious because JD Vance is a very, is a very ambitious person, right? It would be very interesting if Trump were to win and then like a year in, JD Vance invokes the 27th Amendment and gets the cabinet. You know what I mean? And then just assumes the powers of the presidency as like a dictator, right? Like, you know what I mean? This is, if you read Sinclair Lewis's, It Can't Happen Here, right? Which is all about a fascist takeover of the United States. This is exactly what happens, right? Buzz Winthrop, right? Who's this like populist, like grassroots, like hokey dokey type guy, right? Who's a fascist, right? But like, people like him and he's kind of simple. He wins the presidency and then his cabinet and his advisors just basically murder him. And they take over. Right? And it's like, Vance is pretty ambitious, and I can tell you right now, he knows a lot more. He knows about the 27th Amendment. It's like not a lost concept of them. So, but again, I have no evidence for that. Like, that's just it's like interesting, right? To think about.
He fills that same role, and this is kind of why I feel Trump chose him, is because he does fill that same role that that Pence did, but he's younger and a bit more daring than Pence was, right? Like Pence was very steadfast in everything that he believed in and what he believed in. Vance has, at least to give appearances that he's willing to have discussions about things, right? Like he obviously would not care what anybody said, but he's at least like saying like, yeah, I'm definitely open to having a discussion on how you feel about whatever this is and give new information and change my mind. Um, and I feel like that's probably the reason why he was chosen, was because he will do those things. Because I have a feeling that during January 6th, Trump was telling Pence to do things.
Oh yeah.
And Pence was just not doing them.
Yep.
Where
I think we know that for a fact, by the way, that did happen. Yeah.
Right. But the danger for Trump is that Vance is like kind of like what you're saying. Vance will be like, yeah, you're telling me to do things, but nah, I'm not going to do that, but I'm just going to usurp you. And then we don't have to worry about it anymore. And I've got an excuse because you're telling me to do something I shouldn't be doing in the first place.
Right.
JD Vance doesn't seem like the kind of person who'd be upset about being titled an usurper, you know? Like,
right.
I agree.
Same implications that maybe Harris had. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think we're also entering a period. I mean, people have been talking about this for years, right? Where democratic norms, right, that have been established by people like Thomas Marshall and others, right? They have been, people have been tearing them up, right? For good and bad, right? I mean, it's just like, this is in a time of political volatility. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, Vance, we haven't even begun to plumb Vance's psychology, right? This is a guy that for national politics is relatively new to the scene. And there's a lot to be said there, right? I was telling one of my students this. I was like, honestly, like, depending on where this guy goes, it's like political biographers like 200 years from now, like they have some stuff. I mean, all of these figures we're talking about, right? I mean, Obama, Trump, Harris, Biden, all of them, like they are, people have different views on them, and I definitely have my views on them, but it's like every single one of them would make an interesting subject for a massive biography of like how they got to the positions of power that they did. Like very, very outsized personalities, right, in terms of presidential politics.
Yeah, well, there should be plenty of time to talk about JD Vance if Trump loses for sure, and if he wins for sure. Either way,
Right.
I don't think JD Vance is going to be going away anytime soon.
Agreed.
No. I mean, he's the new. I feel like he's just the replacement for Gates, right? Like it within the party. Like he just fits that. He fits that spot, whereas Gates just isn't as popular anymore. Like that's just kind of fallen by the wayside. But he still fits that younger, still willing to say some ridiculous shit, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, just
that spot.
Play to the racist base, right? I mean, this whole campaign, right, of demonizing immigrants, right, in Ohio, right, Haitian immigrants. It's when I saw that, I was just like, yeah, this guy's there's no low that he's not willing to sink to, right? I mean, this is the kind of rhetoric that gets people hurt. It's not true, and it's just blatantly racist. And he was very proud to do it, right? Not ashamed at all. And so, yeah, I mean, we'll see how it goes, But yeah, I do think if Trump loses and he's sentenced to prison, you're probably looking at the next de facto leader of the Republican Party with Vance. I think he's, he probably has what it takes, right? He understands social media. He understands the right-wing base, right? And he doesn't seem to have really any kind of reserve, right, to saying what he needs to say to get ahead.
Yeah, if we had more time, I was going to ask you some questions about like why people choose their vice presidents, like kind of try to talk about that. I mean, I feel like it's kind of interesting with Pence and Vance, the dichotomy between them, because like Pence, I think Trump chose because he was worried people wouldn't see him as Christian enough, as like the Greek worker and like that kind of thing, right? And is Vance there because people don't see Trump as like credibly racist? Like, I mean, I feel like that seems absurd. Like, I don't understand. It seems like normally a vice president is there to capture some demographic that the president himself does not, or herself does not.
So I think Vance does do that. I think he actually does balance the ticket a bit with Trump. Ideologically, they
I mean, again, I think Vance is very much up for sale, right? I mean, like he'll say what he needs to say, but he's young. Trump is old. He's from the Midwest. Trump is from New York. And he's from the working class, right? I mean, like that's Vance's big claim to fame is that he started off fairly impoverished, right, in life and poor. And Trump, was born into wealth. And so I think those things, right, balance it. And also, I mean, Vance is not stupid, right? Vance is, I mean, by all accounts, an intelligent person. And Trump is not. He's just not. And he even is like, no, he just like calls it like he sees it and just, says whatever the hell he wants to say as soon as it comes into his mind, right? He's not an intellectual. Whereas like Vance had that reputation, right, as an author, right, before he entered politics. So I think he very much balances the ticket in a way that Trump will allow, right? In the same way that like with, Harris, right, it's like literally old white man, let's find not old woman of color, right? And it's like Obama is like, let me find an old white man. It's like, and then Harris is like, let me find an old white man, right? It's like, it's like this kind of identities, right? Of like, let's balance the ticket, right? And that sense. And the same thing happened, like, so with Thomas Marshall, right? Woodrow Wilson was originally from the South. He had made his career in New Jersey, and he was an intellectual. He was an academic. And Thomas Marshall was a simple country lawyer, right, who had risen through the ranks of the Democratic Party and become governor of Indiana. He was seen as kind of a Boy Scout, right? Whereas Wilson was kind of seen as conniving, right? A little too smart, right? Definitely racist, right? Being from the South, right? His parents were, I can't remember if they were part of the Confederacy or were sympathetic to the Confederacy. We were from Virginia. And so, yeah, I mean, that's typically the idea, right, is to try to balance the ticket in a way. And I think Trump is probably right. It's like, if I pick a woman of color, my base is not going to care about that. Like, I'm playing to the white supremacist, right? So sure, this is going to be another white guy, right?
I mean, that's how it was with Bush and Cheney, right? Like, Bush was inexperienced. His dad was his dad, but he was inexperienced. And so, like, go with Cheney. He already has power in the party. Don't have to worry about it. If something happens to Bush, it doesn't matter because Cheney's there, right? Even after Cheney had, 3 heart attacks while he was in office or something like that, right? Like, it still doesn't matter because Bush is still young, right?
Yeah, and Cheney is seen as a Washington insider, right? Somebody who knows how to get stuff done, right? Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Another thing that happens, so that's usually it, balancing the ticket. The other is to unify the party, right? So another thing that Clinton is criticized for is that after the primary, it was so bruising and so long. There were some who argued that she needed to pick Sanders as her VP, because it's like this will be a consensus ticket, right? We'll bring both sides together, and she didn't do it. And again, we can debate long and hard if Sanders would have been able to swing it for her or not, right? But it just didn't happen. And yeah, I mean, that is the other thing that happened. So like Reagan does this with George H.W. Bush. And again, they balance each other in other ways as well. But, they had been opponents, right? And gotten pretty nasty with each other in the primary. But to bring the party together, Reagan tapped George H.W. Bush as the VP. And you see how that worked out. I mean, like, say what you want about Reagan, he did understand electoral politics, right? And it got 2 terms out.
Yeah, and that's something that Biden did not do. He didn't pick one of it because it's kind of been that way, at least as long as I've been alive, right? Like, you wind up picking your number 3 or number 4 on the list of who was running against you, right? You don't pick number 2 because they're too close to it. It was too hard of a race. You said really bad stuff about each other. It doesn't look like you can work together. So you picked number 3 or number 4.
Right.
Kamala was out way early in the race. Right. Nobody thought that he would pick her. Like, there was no real talk about it until, I mean, there were some murmurings like, yeah, if he does pick her, he does get the African American vote and whatever the case may be. But it wasn't something that even pundits considered as serious, right? Like, there was a lot of talk about Buttigieg, for example, because he lasted longer. So he didn't do that historically. He picked somebody from that got knocked out really early in the primaries.
Well, at some point, Biden did say he was going to pick a woman of color. So I think at that point,
There was discussions about this because the other thing is the campaign dragged on for quite a bit, well into COVID, right? And I mean, Sanders was still in the running for a while. There was talk about whether or not Biden should choose a really progressive left wing woman of color, like somebody like, I'm not saying exactly like Maxine Waters, but like, somebody like out in California. There was a couple of like black women representatives that were discussed as well. I think by choosing Harris, I actually don't think it for Biden, I don't think it was a bad choice, right? Because he was like demographically, right? Like we wanted to show this progress, but also like ideologically, they're not that far removed. I do think Harris is more to the center, more left on a lot of issues, but they're not. It's not like a how do I say, like AOC or Sanders or something that are like on the left wing of the party, right? And Biden is really on the right wing. I mean, he is more of a conservative within the Democratic Party.
So Harris does seem like she follows the party very down the line.
Yeah. So ideologically,
Like
right, they're similar. It's just they're literally their social identities, right? And their personal identities that differ.
So let's be crazy here. So what's your and if they're not the same thing, that's okay. But what's your prediction and or what's your hope? Let's go that way, and then we'll let everybody have a turn. So it's not just you, Wes.
So I'll just be very honest about this. I edited a journal. I wrote an editorial for our journal, right? I endorse Harris, right? And so I hope Harris wins. And my actual prediction is I think Harris is going. I do think she's going to win. The only thing that gives me pause is I don't know about Pennsylvania if the polls are as close as they say they are, but I'm hoping that the polls are not, and polls often can be wrong. But yeah, I think Harris is going to win, and that's my hope.
But what about you, Rab?
I think that I hope Harris wins in an extremely low turnout election. I mean, it seems like we're not going that way at this point, but I hope the turnout is lower than expected. Just mostly because I don't support her proposed agenda. I don't want Trump in there, but I also don't want Harris in there. And so the less people that get behind both of them, the better, in my opinion. But I still hope for her. And at this point, I am very concerned that it's going to be Trump.
Yeah. What about you, Jeff?
I'm concerned that it's going to be Trump as well. I had a very similar feeling right now that I did in 2016, which is this like just pit in my stomach, but I hope Harris wins. I think if Harris wins, it will be a while before it's confirmed that Harris wins. And I don't know. I think a Harris win could be just as explosive as a Trump win as far as, what happens, domestically with our people here. I don't know that a Harris win will end up with Harris in the White House is really what I'm saying. I hope that's not true. But yeah, my hope is that Kamala will win.
I hope neither of them win. That's my take on this. I hope just nobody votes.
Do you hope Joe Biden wins?
I would have rather. No, that's not true. I would not rather him win. I just hope nobody wins. I also have a pit in my stomach. But it's for a very different reason. Is that I feel the crisis already. I feel like it's inevitable, and no matter which way people vote on this is like kind of what Jeff's saying, but just a little different take on it. Like I feel like it doesn't matter who wins this election in a way, because I don't feel like there's an easy path for either person to actually hold power. I imagine Congress and Senate going Roman style and taking out knives and and attacking each other on the floor. Like I imagine it. I feel like it's viable. And that's how I think about it. I don't know who's going to win. I do have an inkling suspicion that Trump may win. The only thing that throws me off on that is when we look at the Biden and Trump in 2020, the polls showed them as being incredibly close, and Biden pulled it out. In 2016, it was Hillary as a wash over Trump, and he upsets. And so I think the polls are probably more accurately capturing it how they did in 2020, with it being as close as it is. But I think they're underestimating Trump. I don't think they actually are taking him as seriously as they should be, and doing some things that they probably shouldn't be doing. But we'll see.
Yeah, well, I know. I also thought Trump was going to win 2020. I just assumed that based on the fact that, I just thought bad things were going to happen. You know what I mean? Like I let my fear take hold of me.
Well, it's also in over, like, since we've been born and we've been alive, it's much more common for a president to hold 2 terms in a row than it is for them not to.
That's true.
And so we assume that the incumbent's probably going to win, and that just has not been the case since Trump's first. Yeah. So the odds of it flipping back and forth like it has been to continue is much more likely. I feel like it's the pendulum effect. Like,
there's only been one time in U.S. history that somebody has served 2 non-consecutive terms, and that's Grover Cleveland, right? And you have to go back to the 1890s, right, for that. And so, 1880s, 1890s, right? Yeah, but you are right. I was actually just talking to one of my colleagues. He and I studied the same time period, and we were talking about Bush and then Trump and then Biden, right? As one-term presidents. It's like that's not normal for current presidential politics, right? I mean, you have like Jimmy Carter, right? You have George H.W. Bush, right? But it's like, for the most part, if you have the coalition needed to get into the White House, you're going to stay there, right? Like, it's like it's like you've already gotten the job, right? It's like one of those. It's like you've landed the job, so it's yours, right? Until you can't do it anymore, right? With the 2-term limits. With Trump, I mean, I think this is why I have a little bit of hope, is that I think what really hurts Clinton, a whole host of things. Like, this is just my personal opinion. I do not think Hillary Clinton ran a great Clinton. I think she took a lot of things for granted. She misread a lot of things, and she suffered for it, right? He didn't win the popular vote. He won the Electoral College. And then the second time around, he didn't win the popular vote. So I don't look for him to win the popular vote tomorrow. And I do think there are enough people worried, right, in North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that all of those states, all 5 of those states, are firmly in play. But we'll see. Yep. I'm a historian, and I'm not good at predicting the future, right? So
you, the listener, will get to judge us for how wrong we were.
Right, yeah, exactly, right? Well, if you ever have, I would love to come back on, right? But it's like, if we come back on and do the post, like, well, who got it right? Who got it wrong?
I'm obviously wrong. I am obviously wrong. Somebody's going to win.
You're the only one that's right, because no matter who wins, we all lose. But
yeah, that's been my take, and we should definitely have you back on to have another discussion about this afterwards. But my official take is, it doesn't matter, because everything's corrupt. And so it doesn't matter which way we go, we're doomed. That's kind of my take on it.
Well, a lot of damage has been done already by the last 2-3 presidential administrations. So
I feel like I mean, we can go as far back as we want to go. We can start at Reagan. We can start at Bush Sr. We can start at Clinton if we want to. Like, every president has had something that they've done that's pushed us in a bad direction. Right. Like with Clinton, it was NAFTA, right? Like, that was just a bad idea.
Okay, so we could go back to Reagan and all those people, but I feel like we shouldn't at this point. We're pushing our time. I think we.
Oh yeah. I'll stop talking.
Let's do that for another conversation.
But Jeff said I'm right, So let's see whether or not I'm right after tomorrow.
You're right no matter what. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm right no matter what. Okay.
Well, Wes, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We will definitely have you back on. This has been a great conversation. We'll do this again real soon. Do you want to give out any like socials, information, plug anything?
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Yeah. So I think I mentioned in the conversation that I'm the editor at North Meridian Review or North Meridian Press. And so you can often find a lot of my writings there and other people too. We publish a lot of academic and activist writers and artists there. So North Meridian, the North Meridian Review.org.
Great. All right. Well, Wes, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone out in the audience, thanks for listening. If you want to see video of this, sign up for the Patreon. If you want to discuss this, hop on our Discord. And if you want to see random videos that Wiggy posts, check out TikTok. I think it's about it.
All right. Thanks, Wes. Bye, everybody.
Thank you guys. Yep. Talk to you later.